Welcome to our Ask the Expert series. Today we'll be discussing tips on how to avoid common notified body review findings. Our first presenter today is Lori Mitchell, founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Lori has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety and pharmacovigilance management, and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Lori is a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. Also joining us today is Dr. Sarah Chavez, Director of IVD and Scientific Writing Services with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in biochemistry and a PhD in molecular and cellular biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for the past 15 years. Sarah has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment as well as for several large textbook publishers. And her strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as a part of the Criterion Edge team. And now I would like to welcome Lori to give an overview of our session today. Hi, Lori.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We've got a big crowd here today, so let's just get cracking with these questions. I wanted to start with, I think, an obvious disclaimer, as I say there. We are not, Criterion Edge is not a notified body. We are a focused service provider of regulatory writing services. We have worked alongside both our IVDR clients and our medical device clients for a number of years now, especially with medical devices, with assisting them with responses from to put together responses from notified body feedback. So we have a lot of experience understanding what these questions are and where the gaps may come in and how to avoid those. So we hope that this is a practical session today where we can talk about tips and tricks to avoid or at least mitigate. I think avoid is a strong term, but at least mitigate or try to get out in front possible traps that the notified bodies are looking for, those low-hanging fruits, so to speak, of areas that they're going to look at. But so today we're not going to spend a lot of time quoting relevant guidelines, chapter and verse. We think it's much more useful to talk in practical terms, focusing on the root issues of non-compliance found on the notified body response documents that we have worked on with our clients. So let's go to the first slide. We just got one slide today before we get into our questions. Now, this is a busy slide, but we thought that if you wanted to download the webinar afterwards, you can kind of take it in on your leisure. What we wanted to do here is really just, if we take a step back, what are some of the themes that we're seeing from notified body review findings? This is not an all-inclusive list. It's just, we didn't have enough room for that. But there are certain themes that come up. And then we thought it would be useful in the second column, the middle column, and the last column, for those of you that maybe haven't seen notified body feedback yet, to see what they actually say. So those are in quotes. You'll see the intended patient population in the IFU is not defined clearly. Those are their words on notified body responses that we've worked on. Obviously, I've taken out any kind of reference to any specific device or company. I might say in table XX or XYZ indication or something like that. But this is for you to see sort of the cause and the effect, which is the notified body finding. What is the issue that they found, and what are they asking you to do to fix it? We think that that's a very useful way to present this. So again, the first column is talking about what are these bigger themes: inadequate or missing tech file input documents. And this again is not all inclusive. There are other big areas that notified bodies go after, but we thought we'd put these up just to get your kind of your thoughts going on your questions, and please use our Q&A chat box to get those questions coming in. Ask us anything. We've got a large crowd today. We may not get to, I'm sure we won't get to all of your questions, but we'll try as fast as much as possible. Inadequate or missing tech file input documents, safety and performance objectives and state of the art is a big theme, very large theme. And we at Criterion Edge have the opinion, and we'll say it to anybody, that we think the most important and critical section of a CER or a PER is really about establishing the state of the art and the acceptance criteria for the safety and performance objectives. So we'll talk maybe more about that, and some of you may have questions about that. Misalignment, methodology, and presentation are some of the areas that safety and performance objectives and the SOA kind of fall into. Then you see the next meta theme there is risk, benefit, and claims. And finally, clinical data, which really at the end of the day is the most important thing there, is about clinical data insufficiency, which are commonly found. So lots to take in there. I won't walk you through them, but again, I thought it would be interesting, to say, let's just take the first one just to orient your eye. Quote, the intended patient population in the IFU is not defined clearly or consistently within the CER and is not aligned with supportive clinical evidence. The very next sentence on their review was, please propose an indication that is aligned with sufficiently supportive clinical evidence in the CER. And then what we did was specific anatomic location is not their words, it's our words, or XYZ or something like that. We had to de-identify it. That's all I've got to say. I hope this was useful. I think, Olivia, we can go to our questions now.
All right, let's get to the first question here. Let me know, Sarah and Lori, when you can see it on your screen.
We can.
Okay, today our first question is, how stringent are the notified bodies reviewing the acceptance criteria for safety and clinical benefit?
Sarah, what do you think about that?
So I think this is definitely a yes. They are very, very stringent as far as reviewing your acceptance criteria. One of the things that we've noticed is being very specific and precise on your acceptance criteria, particularly when it comes to stratifying across different groups. So for instance, if you're looking at some sort of a vessel device and it's approved for multiple sizes, to include acceptance criteria for large vessels versus small vessel sizes. So it really will depend on your device, but they will pay very close attention to how your acceptance criteria were derived, your choice of competitors, and how those competitors were screened.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Let's go ahead and get to our second question here. Do you always have to scan the entire marketed period for a device, or just the gap since the last CER update?
So this again, it really depends on your project, but let's suppose you have that you're doing an update. For some of these devices, you may require annual updates. You would not be expected to search through the entire period of marketing for your device every single time. Generally speaking, a gap search since your previous CER update is sufficient. The thing to make note of is that you want to make sure that you are including the details about the current search, and that this current search is aligned with your previous search in terms of the search terminology and the mesh terminology that you're using. If you have made a significant update, like let's say you've identified a new safety objective or a risk that you're adding, or a new patient population or indication, then it would be advisable to expand that gap to include the previous 5-year period, basically as a justification for adding to your indications or your patient population.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Moving right along to our next question. Please, could you quote some of the notified body or authority feedback on lack of sufficient clinical evidence for a device?
Yes, so I think we have several of those quotes in that initial table that we've included. I think the main thing that we see regularly is paying close attention to your IFU and your intended purpose. If we see many times where clients will confuse a marketing statement with an actual intended purpose, and they may lack sufficient clinical evidence related to a specific population or indication. So in that case, that will definitely get picked up on. And that sort of goes back to the whole idea of stratifying your acceptance criteria. If you're stating that your device can be used for both adult and pediatric populations, and yet there is no published clinical evidence in a pediatric population, that's going to get picked up on pretty quickly. So you want to make sure that not only is your IFU aligned with your other documents, but that it's supported by the clinical evidence and the search terminology that you're using to develop your acceptance criteria.
And I'll jump in to say, Sarah, that was an excellent answer, very, very comprehensive, and there's a lot to unpack there. Sarah talked about the stratification of clinical data across all intended purposes, uses, and patient population, because I think in the table that we provided in this, there was a very specific comment. I think I put this table together. I chose one specific comment where the notified body picked up that there was a lack of data in one patient population for one indication. And if that happens, you're either going to need to find some clinical data on that or adjust your internal documentation, such as your intended purpose IFU statements. So they will comb through this. The stratification is very important. And I would also like to say, from a writing perspective, the presentation of that is very important too. And I know Sarah is nodding her head, because these notified body reviewers, they have a lot, they will read every word. And the easier you make it on them to be able to see the data and make those linkages that they need to make within your document, the better it is for everybody. So tables, repeating things, see table 6.2 for this, for that. These are writing tips. Make it blindingly obvious to the notified bodies where they need to look or refer to for what information. That's a writing tip for all of us on the call today.
And something as simple as adding hyperlinks within your document,
yes,
to help them jump from section to section, goes a really long way in helping them to easily read through and navigate your document.
Great tip.
That's great, Sarah. Thanks. All right, let's move on to our next question. In our last audit, there was strong focus on quality plans. What is a good way to document when a quality plan is needed without creating a document overload?
So the quality, the whole notion of the quality plans, I think gets back to also this pre-planning that's done, is like, because this is, at the end of the day, the MDR and the IVDR are about your QMS system, your quality management system. So at the heart of all of this is your quality planning. The linkages between quality, risk, device lifetime, all of that needs to be documented in your quality plan should still be there. Downstream from that, I think, now remember, this is an area of expertise, an area that we are not experts in because we don't work within companies themselves. But, Sarah and I both have worked within companies. We've seen these plans. We're familiar with them, but we don't manage them. Criterion Edge doesn't manage those plans and normally do not update quality plans. But if the question is, what's a good way to document when a quality plan is needed, I would also add to that, or an update to a current quality plan is needed without creating a document overload. That's a complex, I think that's a complex, it's an easy question with a complex answer. And it has to do with the interplay within your own organization of your cross-functional team members. Often we see the quality people coming in during cross-functional review, the regulatory people coming in during cross-functional review of the CER or PER, and putting their eyes on it from their perspective. What is needed here? Is this in alignment with the documents that they oversee? So a good way to document an update to a quality plan or an additional quality plan is to make sure that internally you're involving the cross-functional team from the beginning. And I think we even kind of comment that on that in the table, is it that early planning? And then your quality folks are on board with the strategy and the whole process. So I don't know if that was a very useful answer to the person that wrote this. I think she can certainly reach out to me if she wants more information on that. We can talk about her question further if she'd like. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. And I want to remind everyone here today that for attending, you are welcome to book a 30-minute consult with us, speak with one of our specialists. You can book directly with the link in the chat, or you can also email us at consult@criterionedge.com. Here's our next question. How do you limit state-of-the-art searching to a reasonable number?
Yes, that is definitely the trick. We've held several webinars focused entirely on the SOA, and I believe some of them have even included some sort of helpful tips for devising your strategy. But it really comes down to having well-defined PICO terms for your population, indications, comparators, and outcomes. To have a robust search platform that you can use to actually search across multiple databases using very well-defined mesh terminology. That's not just doing a Google search or even a simple PubMed search, but by using the correct terminology, you can limit it or make exclusions or try to ensure that you're not capturing off-target hits. Because really, when it comes down to it, the SOTA search can get quite large if you're using very, very broad terms. I guarantee if you have an IVDR that is related to COVID, you could easily be looking at tens of thousands of hits if you don't know how to properly craft your SOTA terms. So to be able to identify sort of any limits that you would like to put on the search to be able to make it more targeted, I think that's the main focus here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. Here's our next question. What is the most complex requirement around CERs by EU MDR?
From our perspective, I would say it really comes down to that state-of-the-art section, because it really does touch on all of the different technical documents that you're expected to present. It's going to directly inform your risk management systems, your PMS system. Everything is going to ultimately come back to what you've identified in the state of the art. So through that search, that's how you're identifying what are the alternatives, what are the direct comparators, and then what are the most commonly reported and most directly meaningful performance and safety objectives. So when it comes down to it, if you have not properly crafted your state-of-the-art search and you're either missing a risk because you haven't searched for that particular term and you've not located, or if you're just simply excluding all case studies, and then there happen to be several case studies that are identifying a particular risk, you want to make sure that you're still screening for those and capturing those, so that if there are these sort of single reports that are popping up, you're identifying those. So from our perspective, it really does come down to having a really solid understanding of your intended purpose, and making sure that the data that you're presenting is most directly aligned with that intended purpose statement, and ensuring that it's capturing all of the data that is relevant to your patient populations or potential indications.
Okay, great. Moving right along. What are the expectations for formatting the performance evaluation report? Do the notified bodies have specific templates?
So as of now, really, there are no templates. So the best advice that we are giving to our clients is to stick with sort of the format and the overall structure that we have been experienced with in the CER world. The main difference here is that there are these feeder documents with IVDR. You have the SVR, the scientific validity report, the APR, which is the analytical performance report, and then the CPR, that's the clinical performance report. So in the case of developing your template for a PER, you're still going to have all of the main features of a typical CER, but you would want to make it clear which data sets you're speaking about in terms of either your competitor data, your device data, and whether that device data is clinical performance data or analytical performance data. They will have different performance measures and different names and different searches that you're going to conduct to collect those types of data, but making sure that that's very well organized so that it's clear when you're speaking about your device's data as opposed to the competitive landscape. I think that's the main thing to focus in on as you're developing your templates.
All right. This person is asking Sarah, can you use equivalent devices clinical data without a contract for either class 1s or class 2A and 2B, as long as you have support for the data? If yes, what qualifies as supporting data?
Well, Sarah, I can jump in on that first to talk about the first part of it, which is, can you use equivalent devices, clinical data, without a contract for class 1s, 2A, and 2B? To be very specific, so I'm not quite sure what the questioner is asking there or saying there. But the rule is, I think many people are aware of, that the rule is when establishing equivalence, that the device which you establish, device or devices with which your subject device is compared to for equivalence sake, you must have full access to the technical file of that equivalent device so that you can compare the clinical, technical, and biological characteristics across from the equivalent device to the subject device or devices. And then by doing that, point by point, identifying the elements that of those three domains of characteristics, identifying whether they are same or similar. Similar means there is a difference, which then must be justified in your equivalent section of your CER. The same would go true for a PER. So that's that if you establish equivalence, and on my, I'll say on the table that was prepared, I didn't really go into equivalence because that's a specific area that's not always used in CERs and PERs, but when it is, it's fraught with potential landmines. If you don't do a very good job of marching through every clinical, technical, and biological aspect in the greatest detail of your devices, both equivalent and subject, the notified body will pick up on that and they will challenge it. And to draw it out to its logical conclusion is establishing equivalence usually means that the subject device under evaluation, you're worried that there is not adequate clinical data available directly on the subject device. Therefore, establishing equivalence with another device establishes the all for one, one for all scenario of data for one is applicable to data for all. And if they find any, and so that's data. I always say the notified bodies look where data is concerned. They look at your systematic literature review because that's where data is identified. They look at equivalence because that's where it's established that data is equivalent. And that's the thing in our opinion, that is the number one place that notified bodies look. Are their data, are they sufficient? Are they applicable to all of your indications for use in patient populations? Data is, to many of us at Criterion Edge, is the master of the CER and PER. So if that's what the questioner meant, I answered that part. And so I'm not really sure, Sarah, do you have any thoughts about supporting data, which is, I think, maybe equivalent data, but any further thoughts on that, Sarah?
Yes, I'm sort of reading the supporting data as the data relevant to these equivalent devices, but also potentially data relevant to like the performance of a system overall. So if you suspect particularly if it's a class 1 or class 2, maybe there isn't a whole lot of data reported specifically on that device's performance, but you can state that when it's included as part of a larger system, here's what the overall procedural success or technical success. So in that case, I think that's very commonly used if it's something that you just don't expect to see a whole lot of specifics reported on, like a guide wire or something like that.
Yeah, Sarah brought up a great point that we talk a lot about in our webinars and are asked about with legacy devices or simple devices, which quote unquote, no one ever writes about in published literature, and there's very little data on it. And we haven't done clinical trials on our new guide wire or, name the device. How do we establish safety and performance for a relatively simple or straightforward device like that, even if it's class 2A or 2B? Again, in published literature, you're never really going to find anything about it specifically. So Sarah just talked about really what she was talking about was the surrogate safety and performance objectives, right, Sarah? You were talking about establishing the safety and or the performance of your guide wire, for example, by the drawing the logical conclusion that if the procedure were successful, then that must mean that the guide wire performed successfully. And no AEs were reported during the procedure. Therefore, the guide wire met its safety goal. So is that right, Sarah?
Yes.
Okay. Well, great question.
Here's our next one. Do historical clinical trials not meet the requirements of MDR primarily because they occurred before 2017? What do we think about this question?
If the questions means that would I have to exclude clinical data on my device because it existed and was gathered prior to MDR becoming something real, we started the MDR cadence. The answer is no, you do not need to exclude it. Sarah, do you have thoughts?
Yes. So we often include this as part of our narrative or our background section, particularly if there are like very pivotal trials that really sort of set the stage for or are referred to regularly within a particular field. So yeah, you would definitely want to include, you wouldn't want to just ignore a very important historical clinical trial. But that being said, you wouldn't also want to include every single article ever published on your device as part of your analysis. You're trying to establish state of the art. So that's usually where that 5-year time frame comes in. And I believe there was another question from someone in the chat about the time frames for state of the art. We generally limit that to 5 years because you're trying to take into account that technologies change. And as you have more and more knowledge of how to do a particular technique, you're going to improve with the operator's ability to do the technique successfully. We're going to learn from different mechanisms and different procedures. So we use the past 5 years to help us really focus in on what the current state is. But you can certainly refer to historical trials or even find meta-analyses that will go back decades to be able to really establish what that historical range was.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. Moving on to our next question. For devices or products approved under MDD, do you need to repeat the literature search or only do a gap analysis?
My suggestion would probably be to start with a preliminary literature search, just to establish that baseline for your MDR submissions. As long as you're not changing a whole lot from your previous search, you could certainly use it. But if you are changing any indications or any terminology or adding or subtracting it, you're always better off just conducting a new updated search.
Okay, thanks. All right, here's our next question. Our notified body wants stratification combination-wise, combination as in 2 or more implant components combined for implantation. This complicates things as some combinations would not have clinical data. Lori, do you have anything you want to say about this?
Well, this is so with regards to combination 2 or more implant components combined for implantation. Some combinations would not have clinical data. So I can't quite tell what's going on here, but I will start with a couple of my assumptions, and starting with the last sentence. This complicates as some combinations of these components would not have clinical data, if that's what I'm understanding. Combination of 2 or more implant components. All right.
And I think in my experience, you can just state that those were not found, those particular combinations. You would still attempt to stratify it, maybe by having in a tabular format columns that would help you distinguish between the different combinations. But then as a limitation, the data is only as good as it is. If no one has published on that particular combination in clinical data sets, you wouldn't be expected to find that in the clinical literature.
Right. That's an excellent point, Sarah. And then, so let's just say that these are combinations. Let's just say there's an A and a B and a C component, let's just say. And in one device, A and C are combined. And in another device, B and C are combined. I'm just making that up. So now we have 2 different devices which are have different sets, different combination sets. One thing that I'm wondering about, Sarah, is that would these be included in one CER? And could you, if this is a CER, these are medical devices, and if you could establish equivalence between them, and because of these shared components, that might be an interesting approach that would need to be thought of a little bit more. And then you're back to the data for one is data for all. But I will go on to say is that if component B and component C work in different patient populations or different anatomical locations, getting back to that, is that you have to address those specifically. And if there is data in the device that combines B and C, and there's only data to support the C component, but not the B component, then you're going to need to find that data for component B. Do you agree with that? You can't. I don't think you have to have data for every aspect of the device, whether you're calling it a component or anything else. Sarah?
Yeah. Yes. So as long as you have data for one component of the device in one of those combinations, I would think that you would then be expected to explain why the data for the other combination didn't exist. And maybe it's something as simple as like those two components would not be used in the same anatomy or in the same patient population. It could be sort of a size limitation in some cases, not knowing any specifics about this device, but.
Yeah, that's an excellent question and really a very, very specific and detailed one, but it does open a dialogue that many of you might be thinking about, which is, this whole thing about the inadequacy of clinical data is one, as I said before, I'll keep banging that drum, is very, very important to the notified bodies. They're going to be looking just at things like that. But Sarah said something important in there is that sometimes there are no data for certain indications or pieces or statements within an indication. And there you must tread carefully with your justifications and your how you report your data and the data search, and that you show the notified body and demonstrate to the notified body that in your literature searching that there are no data for that in your competitors with regards to acceptance criteria and safety and performance. This all gets very tangly, and I think we're going down a rabbit hole. So we'll stop with this question because there are many more. But this is a very complex pathway sometimes to take that really requires, I think, you and within your companies to have very specific conversations about this and make very specific decisions with regards to possibly equivalence, to bolster one device with another device's data. Those kinds of our strategies are the stuff made of internal conversations, that's for sure.
All right. Thanks, Lori. Let's get to our next question. We only have a couple minutes here. How far back should the state-of-the-art search period go?
Generally speaking, we usually rely on a 5-year search period for SOTA because that's what's currently considered to be state of the art. If you do identify, like I said, those pivotal studies that were done prior to that, you can certainly mention them. But in terms of the data that you're going to use to help you justify what are the techniques and technologies that are the most current and considered to be state of the art right now, I would go back about 5 years.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. This person is asking if an MDR device is under evaluation and an MDD legacy device is exactly the same. Do we need to list the MDD data and MDR data clearly and separately, or mix all the data together?
Data is data, right, Sarah? Doesn't matter if those data, clinical data is derived from, it comes from multiple sources. Manufacturer held data, that's PMS safety data, complaint data. It's any clinical investigations data you do, and any other PMCF or PMPF data you may or may not have, just for starters. So whether those data were collected inside or before MDR, MDD turned to MDR, data are data, and if they're robust and they're still applicable, you should be using those data sets. So we've had clients want us to go back 10 plus years in our searches because they have data that are older, that those data were derived from their clinical investigations 7, 8, 10 years ago. Are those data still relevant? Yes. If they are relevant to the current state of your device. If your device hasn't changed, its indications haven't changed, then yes, those data are still relevant. So it doesn't matter if you mix them.
Okay. Here's our next question. Should you integrate clinical evaluation into the design and development process? And are safety and performance standards and acceptance criteria design inputs and need to be established during the R&D stage, even before the CEP or CER?
Sarah, I can take that question. The answer is yes and yes. Should you integrate clinical evaluation in the design and development process? Absolutely. From our experience, again, we are not internal device manufacturers, but we see the benefits of that early integration in across your cross-functional teams, even to design and development, with their eye on what are the ultimate safety and performance objectives. What do you want that device that you're now designing to do, in whom, and how would you measure its success? Absolutely goes from the design team all the way forward. And our safety and performance standards and accepted design inputs need to be established. I don't know that they need to be established, but they need to be talked about. Safety and performance standards. You could do, for example, if your design development team, we've been working with a client that is in early stages of a product design and medical devices, and they wanted to know what their competitors were doing and what kind of data were their competitors reporting in published literature. Well, we did a competitor search for them and pull data on exactly what they wanted to know. Tell us these things. Pull these data on these types of questions or issues. And our team did that, and that helped define and inform the design development team's design decisions. So absolutely, it's relevant early on. And then once that's all built into the device itself, those safety and performance objectives, and ultimately the competitors for which you're going to derive your acceptance criteria, you can move forward, your whole team can move forward with greater confidence, knowing where the acceptance criteria are coming from and what the safety and performance objectives are based on.
All right, here's our next one. Is there any issue from a notified body perspective with a combined PMS PMCF plan?
We have found that since we started working with our first clients in 2016, 2017, 2018, even in 2019, we saw our clients internally make decisions about combining those. Just put the PMCF plan, if you will, embedded into the overall PMS plan. And we've written documents like that for a couple of years. We are seeing now, this is just our trend. This is, again, we don't know what the notified body is saying, but we're seeing all of our clients now pulling those apart. PMS is a freestanding report or plan. PMCF is a freestanding plan. One thought about that is that if you need to rev those plans, like you need to rev something in the PMCF plan, why rev, but you don't need to rev it in the PMS? Well, then that's just one less document you need to manage in your QMS system, the revision. So that's one practical standpoint of splitting them apart.
Okay, great. Here's our next question, Lori. How do you integrate complaints data via CER to benefit risk? Example, literature has adverse events and so does complaints. Do notified bodies expect both feeding into benefit risk through the CER? And does that form part of the state of the art?
Sarah, you want me to take at least the first part of that, at least on a high level? Maybe you can, because I know Sarah is very expert at the state of the art section in the CER and then all things IVDR.
Yeah.
So I know she has thoughts on this as well, but complaints data must be linked back to benefit risk at the end of the day. It's part of your manufacturer held data because it comes into you passively, but it comes in through PMS reporting channels. So again, when we run literature searches looking for subject device data reported in published literature, our review team always extracts any adverse events that they see upon review of the full text article for an included article. So that gets to the literature has adverse events. We do capture that, and that then feeds back into the whole evaluation process. So yes, notified bodies do expect all of this to feed back into the benefit risk of the company through the CER. Well, the CER reports on that. They don't do the work itself. Remember, the clinical evaluation report is just that. It is a report on all of the clinical evaluation processes required under MDR or IVDR within your organization: risk, clinical, quality, regulatory, all of those cross-functional teams. So that is, they want to see that demonstrated, that feedback loop demonstrated in the CER. Sarah, any thoughts on that, or the state of the art?
I think it comes down to all of the different components that are considered to be part of this whole technical document, like your portfolio. You know, you're going to have data from the QMS, you're going to have your risk management information, and then within that is the actual clinical evaluation, or in IVDR, the performance evaluation. So in that case, you are going to want to combine in your risk analysis, taking into account what other similar competitor devices have identified as relevant clinical risks, and then also take into account any risk that has been identified through trend reporting, through complaints or databases. You know, there's going to be multiple sources of these complaints data, but all of those will be presented in that risk analysis within the actual CER. So the SOTA will contribute to that by identifying the risks that have been reported based on guidelines or reputable organizations, as well as the complaints and risks that have been identified within your competitive landscape. But the actual data relevant to your device, that will get picked up by your own post-market surveillance.
This attendee is saying one of our primary challenges is identifying performance criteria for a de novo product. How far from the product intended purpose can one stray to seek clinical evidence in a literature search?
I would say it comes down to, assuming this is an IVDR product, it's going to come down to aligning your data with that intended purpose. I would not stray too terribly far from your intended purpose overall. You're still going to want to, if it's a de novo product and there aren't any other direct competitors, your competitive landscape may rely more heavily on alternative diagnostics or alternative therapeutics if it's a MDR submission. But in that case, it's, you know, within the state of the art section, you would identify basically all of the alternatives. You would determine ranges for those alternatives, and then you could state, you'll have to go into a little bit more detail as far as maturity of the technology, because if it's a de novo product, there isn't a whole lot of maturity of technology if you're the only one. You need to establish why that is, what new information or new advantages or disadvantages does your product provide, and then how does that compare to the alternative ways of making a diagnosis or treating a condition. But it all comes back to that intended purpose statement. So I would just keep that at the forefront and make sure that you are not getting too off target in identifying clinical evidence that may be sort of related to, but not directly attributable to your particular test.
Sarah, that was a great the summary of that. And I would just point out to those of us on the call that this is, it's in these spaces, these complex decision-making spaces, where the presentation of these arguments and the justification behind those arguments is critical. It's critical that they are well formulated. They're very clear to the notified body. They know they can follow your train of thought and your strategy. And then at the end of the day, if they can, then you hope they agree with the strategy. But if they have difficulty following your strategy, and what you're aiming for and the justification of that strategy, you're sort of done before you start. Is that they're just going to ask questions because it's not clear to them what your strategy is. Therefore, they would worry that it's not clear to you. And so these strategy decisions in cases like this are very critical to mock up, to write up, and to say this is exactly what our strategy is, and now it needs to be written up so that it's clear to the notified body in the CER or PER.
All right. Thanks, Lori. Getting back to the PER, where in the EU MDR are these mentioned? Is there an MDCG guidance regarding them?
So within the PER, you're going to really be looking at there is a guidance document. I'm trying to see if I can collect the name off the top of my head. Let's see. I will look for that.
So one thing I would say is that getting back to the PER, where in the EU MDR are these mentioned? So of course that would be, if we're talking about a PER, we're talking about an IVD, an in vitro device, which would come under EU IVDR.
Yes, there is an MDCG guidance. It's the 2020-16 that goes directly to the classification of IVDs, which is kind of your first main step in identifying developing your classification. So I think that would probably be the best place to start as far as trying to identify sort of how the PER is structured and what the specific guidances are relative to the PER. There are quite a few guidances out there, and even if you're doing certain types of tests, they will provide very specific guidance in different examples.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. Here's our next question. How specific should your CER be in regards to marketing claims that are found on the label? Or notified body seems to want an extensive list of claims and supporting data versus buckets of core claims.
Well, let's unpack that. How specific should your CER be in regards to marketing claims that are on the label, on labeling claims? Very specific. Those claims there must be, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, there must be clinical evidence, clinical data to support every claim made. Mm-hmm. Now, claims can range into areas where there's subjective terms being used, like the best, the fastest, improved. Improved isn't so, could be quantified, but best or fastest, words like that. So you have to be careful about your claims to avoid putting in subjective terminology that can't be quantified. Our notified body seems to want an extensive list of claims. Yes, they would want to know your claims and the supporting data for each one of those claims. Do you agree with that, Sarah? That is not an unusual request.
No, and it will ultimately feed back into the general safety and performance requirements, that those performance characteristics are provided or stated on the label. You are expected to identify relevant performance objectives based on those general safety and performance requirements.
And must be able to getting back to the question, with regards to data, there must be supporting data for claims.
So yeah, if your label has a claim that is not supported by any of your data, that's going to get noticed.
That will be flagged. And that means whether or not there are data to support the claim that it works best in pediatric populations, or it works this way under these kinds of circumstances, or in these types of anatomical locations, all of that. Or a larger issue, which would be, that how do you say improved? Our XYZ device provides improved outcomes or improved, whatever it is. how you have to define improved based upon whose data, improve over what. So these kind of claims, every claim, the notified bodies look at your marketing claims. They take a great deal of time looking at claims. I think maybe just one more question, Sarah. We've kept everybody over, and we thank you. One thing I'd like to say to the group before we all jump off after this next question is that if you've got really specific questions that you want to talk to us about, I think there's been, our team has been putting up little notices to, contact us if you want a 30-minute free consultation with me or anyone else on our team to discuss any of your questions. So please feel free. That's why we have those. So Olivia, let's go to our last question.
All right, Lori, here's our last question. How do you handle legacy devices of a product like a PTCA catheter, since many of these devices are approved on Equivalence and have limited new data?
One thing, and I'll let Sarah jump in too. One thing I would say is that if these catheters are approved using Equivalence, then the first thing you're going to want to ensure within your company that the equivalent device that your device X catheter, PTCA catheter, was based on, let's say the device X is the newest version and device ABC was the equivalent, the earlier version. And if you have not been collecting data on your new version, device X, and you haven't been updating your data on device A, B, or C, or worse yet, you've retired it since then. So don't cut off your, the route to data on your newer device by, say, revving out or changing or altering its equivalent device. You're good to go if you're still collecting data on device A, B, or C, the equivalent device. And in the meantime, you are collecting data on your new device, the device X. If you're collecting data on those and equivalence can still be established between the two, you've got a good data set going with all in, patient populations, intended uses, and so forth. But we have seen clients get a new device, slid in under MDD with minimal data, and then don't lay plans to continue to start collecting data on that new device, while in the meantime, they're retiring the equivalent device. Now you've left that new device hanging out there with no new clinical data that you're collecting. So be careful of that.
All right, I think we are out of time. I hope we were able to answer most of your questions today. I know there were a lot. If you want to book a meeting with us, you are welcome to email us at consult@criterionedge.com. You can book a 30-minute consultation with us to ask us your questions. Thank you again, Sarah and Lori, and everyone for joining us and for your great questions. Take care, and I hope to see you at our next webinar.
Thank you, everyone.